Me to start sharing, Praveen.
Yeah, if you could just put your slide on, so that
Yeah.
would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Happy to do that. I think.
While I'm just setting this up here.
Yep, it's coming, right?
Yeah.
Full screen. Okay.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us in today's webinar. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of intro about the webinar and about myself. I'm just trying to get people in and we'll keep on doing this. So my name is Paveen Ali and I work at the University of Sheffield as Senior Lecturer. And this webinar series is hosted by one of the networks, World University Network, which has funded the project, and we work on the intimate partner violence and mental health impacts of intimate partner violence. It's a cross-country project, and we have got colleagues working from Australia, UK, Ghana, USA, New Zealand, Maastricht, and other countries. And what we are hoping to do through these projects is to understand how much do we know about the impacts of domestic abuse, and especially the mental health impacts of domestic abuse, and how can we make services better to support people better. So that's the sort of stuff that we do. So through this webinar series, we talk about various issues related to domestic abuse. We try and do this once a month. And today, our guest is Dr. Romina Istirati, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of intro about Romina, and Romina will be able to tell you about her project as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If I could just ask you to please keep yourself muted during the webinar, that would be great. And we will have a chance to listen to Romina. And once she has finished talking, then we could take up questions and answers, and we could just take it on from there. If you think of any questions, please, you can keep posting onto the chat box, or you can keep a note of it. And then we could, once the talk is finished, we can start going through the questions into the chat box. And also, you may be able to ask questions in person by yourself. So that's the sort of a plan for today, if that's okay. I am not sure if there is anything which I am missing. If I am, please drop me a text and I'll try and answer that. So without any further delay, I'll just tell you a little bit about Romina. Romina Istirati is a research associate in the Department of Development Studies and the Center of World Christianity at SOAS University of London. She previously served as Senior Teaching Fellow to the School of History, Religion and Philosophies, teaching on religion and development in sub-Saharan Africa. She is a critical international development thinker and practitioner with decades of long experience in exploring and developing cosmology, sensitive and people-centered methodology and approaches for analyzing and addressing issues around gender dimensions in non-Western religious societies. And since 2016, she has been working to decolonize research in domestic violence in the context of Africa, pointing to the need for grounding the analysis of domestic violence in the conceptual repertoires and languages of local communities. So in today's talk, she's going to share findings of a year-long theology-informed ethnographic study on domestic violence within an Ethiopian Orthodox community. So I will let Romina to provide any other information that I may have missed. Apologies if I did. So thank you so much, Romina, for doing this, and welcome on the webinar, and over to you.
Well, thank you for having me, Praveen. First and foremost, is my voice clear? Yes?
Yes. Just to say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everybody,
Okay.
Which then means that you will also be muted, so you will have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Um,
So let me.
okay.
Lovely. So you can still hear me now.
Yes. Yeah.
Lovely.
So yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to try and see if I can change the slide. Yes, I can. Yes, so thank you for having me, Parveen. It's a pleasure. I was in the previous webinar you did, and I find them very, very informative. I think it's a really timely initiative to try and bridge, research and practice, and see how we can, or learn together and see how we can improve our practices. The topic today that I will present on is based on my research, but it's also a bit more experimental, I guess, in a sense, because I'm trying to integrate psychological theories of violence and psychological ways of approaching domestic violence with ethnographic research and anthropological and sociological research. And that in itself is a very difficult task. So I don't know how successful I will be. I will make an attempt, and then I'll explain as I go through what I'm trying to do. So hopefully that will become clear. So the agenda for today, as I envision it, I have about 40 minutes to speak, maybe a little bit beyond, is to say a bit about my background, which you did very, very generously and well, Praveen, and then discuss a bit the motivations behind this research, and look at the relative, so the relevant literatures, which is primarily gender and development that I specialize in, and public health, both fields that engage with domestic violence in low and middle income countries and sub-Saharan African region in particular, where I am based. And then I will sort of look at how these account essentially for religious systems, faithfulness, and the interface with human psychology, and how this might be done better, because I think there is currently some shortage there, and some possibilities that we can explore further. And then I'll move on to look at the ethnographic study in Ethiopia, to sort of demonstrate some of what we know already in the literature of those relationships, and challenge a bit those relationships on the basis of what the study actually shows, suggesting also some linkages with psychological parameters. Now, of course, just to give this disclaimer early on, no ethnographic research can actually, sort of provide conclusive insights into psychological relationships, because these are causal relationships that need to be established, using experimental and statistical tools. But it can still point us to certain relationships that we can explore further, perhaps in the future, in a more quantitative or in a more statistical or econometric way. So as Praveen said, my background, I'll just note in addition that my whole motivation has been to ground the analysis of gender sensitive issues, including domestic violence, in the local belief systems and the conceptual repertoires of the local community. So that is really the terms in which people think and speak, starting with language, but also moving to concepts, ideas, beliefs, and values. So really being grounded locally. And that requires, different approaches, multidimensional studies, ethnographic studies, such as the one I try to conduct. I don't know how successfully, and studies that actually we lack currently. They're not as extensive as one would think. So the motivations are informed, as I said, by the shortfalls in the literatures I deal with. So within a lot of global health and development, gender and development research, there is a lot written about gender-based violence, and that etiology, that explanation, which favors gender parameters and explanatory factors to explain domestic violence, has been used and internationalized quite a bit through different international conventions. But it's primarily used sociologically. So it's based on a theory that then is applied on the basis of sociological analyses. Comprehensive ethnographic studies, as I said, that demonstrate how gender beliefs, social norms, and human behavior really relate to each other causally are missing. And I've noted some references that sort of move in this direction, which are really helpful and insightful if you'd like to read further. And because of the emphasis on this terminology, the gender-based violence terminology, and this etiology, again, this explanation, etiology means explanation, Because the focus is on gender parameters, again, most attention has been given to women, which leading to the unfortunate lack of attention to men who tend to be the primary perpetrators. And although this has started to change, again, we'd lack the kind of locally grounded analysis to understand perpetrator motivations and local risk factors in relation to the wider belief systems in which men find themselves in. And the other point or limitations that I see is that the etiology has fostered a tendency to appraise religious and cultural traditions as loci, as locations of female subordination. So the tendency is to really think that these are negative and pernicious and need to be subverted. And in the effort to change the status quo, which means that the resourcefulness of religious belief systems, but also the importance of spiritual living for the different communities is not appreciated as it should or could. And the other critique I have is informed by coloniality. By this understanding that colonial legacies continue epistemologically through theory and knowledge production. And I have seen that, a lot of this literature neglects to look at ontogenetic, so, related to biological and genetic factors, psychological and relational factors of domestic violence, despite ascribing to an ecological model of violence, which ideally should look at all these parameters in an integrated way. And what is interesting to me is that when I look at the literature in North America and Western Europe, there is a multiplicity of paradigms. There is feminist studies, family studies paradigms, psychological, psychoanalytical paradigms that place attention both to feminist explanations and gender sensitive parameters, but also to psychological, intergenerational, situational, and other factors of domestic violence, but also the mutuality of some intimate partner abuse. So there seems to be a double standard because those theories are not really applied in the low and middle income countries where the primary explanatory factor are cultural or sociocultural theories or sociological etiologies, again, emphasizing cultural explanations and justifications for the abuse and its continuation. And citing Uma Narayan and Latif Loeb, who have questioned this and criticized this before me, I'm asking, can this stubborn emphasis on cultural or sociological explanations of IPV in low and middle income countries actually reflect to some extent the continuation of historical racist or colonialist beliefs vis-a-vis African countries, and this idea that African cultures are inherently violent, which tended to be an assumption that underpinned historical scholarship. So I think on the basis of these limitations that I have discussed, there is a need to try and engage better with religious systems faithfulness, but also to try and bridge that with human behavior and psychology, the psychological theories of violence, which are so insightful and helpful, and see how we can further knowledge and understanding. So there are different sectors and literatures that we can draw from. You might know the established field of spiritual psychotherapy and counseling in North America. I believe it was in a boom in the 1990s. And these also include essentially studies of how spiritual psychotherapy is used in marital contexts and the implications for addressing intimate partner violence, essentially. There's also literature now which is emerging and rising, especially in the UK, on mental health and spirituality. As many of you might know, a lot of emphasis on trauma and what that implies for abusiveness in the intimate relationship. There are also studies that link religious beliefs to attachment models. In the last webinar, Perveen had a speaker, I can't remember the name of the professor, who spoke about attachment theory and took us through. So there are a lot of studies that actually try to bridge attachment theory, personality disorders and domestic violence with religiosity or religious commitment or religious experience. These are different terms that are being used in these fields. And also studies that look specifically at the role of religious values, such as forgiveness, for example, or conflict resolution tendencies or inclinations, or church attendance, usually church attendance, because most of these studies are with Western populations, Catholic, Protestant tradition. So obviously the terminology is influenced by those studies. And how attendance, for example, influences how people treat each other in intimate relationships. And finally, which the studies I find most helpful, anthropological and qualitative studies that examine domestic violence in different religious cultural contexts, usually in a more multidimensional, locally grounded way that allows us to really get into the narrative and the life story of the victim, survivor, or perpetrator. So on the basis of this literature, we can draw some sort of insights of what is known, what is believed currently in the existing scholarship. So there's a few studies that show, as many would think, that abusive men may have distorted understandings of religious teachings. This is not unrelated to the family environment in which they grow up in. So the influence of the parental attachment figure, which I will come back to later. And they could use that to frame essentially their attitudes, which could be justifying essentially indirectly their abusiveness. On the other hand, religious women who experience husband abuse might tend either to endure it or forgive it because of a direct, as a direct result of how they understand or embody their religious teachings for specific theological traditions. This doesn't happen in all traditions, for some traditions, or because of what they believe is the norm, the authoritative religious tradition followed by the wider society. And this is what I call vernacular religious tradition. So vernacular, for me, is the tradition as everyone lives it in the culture in everyday life. Theology and theological teachings refer to, authoritative exegesis and hermeneutics as upheld in the specific tradition. And also there are insights and studies, on the other hand, that show that female victims might in fact resort to religious beliefs to condemn the abuse they experience, and that through the ordeals, they actually become more empowered and acquire a justice-oriented understanding. And that helps them actually to address their situation and get out of it, to try and get out of it. And the other set of studies that exist, again, mostly from anthropological contexts, suggest that, oftentimes religious traditions are embedded in wider folklore belief systems. It can be a Christian community that in Ghana that also ascribes to some other spiritual beliefs, so there's a more syncretistic system. And so these beliefs essentially co-act with the authoritative religious tradition to influence various attitudes, which again can inform domestic violence and it's the responses of the society to it. Now, I want to make the point again here because I gave an overview, but most of the studies I've looked at are informed by specific contexts and happen in specific religious traditions. So theological and exegetical traditions matter, and they're very important. It's very important to take, in my experience, a theology, a tradition-specific approach, because as I will explain, each tradition enables different kinds of discourses around gender, around marriage, and it may provide weaker or stronger possibilities for using religious idiom to justify, attitudes or norms or practices that don't necessarily directly condone domestic violence, but indirectly they might perpetuate certain norms or practices or mentalities that can actually allow the continuation of the problem, or or not resolving it really at a societal level. So most of the studies I mentioned are informed, as I said, by the Catholic, Protestant, evangelical Christian communities, because most of these studies happen in Western societies. Some Muslim societies, I believe one of the studies I mentioned by Sheikh was conducted in South Africa. But there has been less on Eastern or Oriental Orthodox Christian societies, which is the tradition that this study sits in. Which is a bit different, certainly from Western Christianity. So in this tradition, although there have been cultural variations, there are multiple sort of facets of Orthodox traditions in the East, theology has generally been understood as being co-substantial with praxis. So it's all about doing, practicing that teaching. And due to historical and political and sort of various other developments in these countries that are historically Orthodox, whether it is Eastern Europe or Ethiopia, there has been a more accommodating also approach to pre-existing belief systems as well, so as to not alienate the adherents, but also to sort of propagate the message of the theology of the church. So that means that these traditions have been quite accommodating to pre-existing belief systems. So it's really important to not identify directly the embodiments of the faithful today with what we would consider theological teaching. So while the faithful will very much use the word of orthodoxy and ascribing to the authoritative tradition to avoid heresy, that means deviation from the true faith, what they actually do in real life doesn't necessarily mean it reflects Orthodox theology. Because of the way it was taught, transmitted historically, various factors sort of impeded the proper communication of the theology in each country, including Ethiopia. So one has to, when one does ethnographic research, one needs to keep in mind the theological tradition and the broad teachings of the church, but one should also not identify this too directly, because there's much more to ethnographic analysis. And so what does that mean? That means that pernicious attitudes, whether it is around women or marriage, could reflect, in fact, a lack of theological literacy in the community of adherents, even as they use religious idiom to justify their everyday practices. Or it could also mean that the wider society emphasizes values that appear also to be prioritized in the faith, such as marriage, until death do us apart, or female virginity. But these are emphasized in a way that is actually distorted in everyday life. And essentially, the message to take away from this is that it's important to, again, when we engage with the religious tradition, to understand their distinct theological and exegetical premises, not just in lip service, so the official discourse of the church or the religious authority in place, but also how it's been communicated historically, how it's been practiced historically by the religious personnel on the ground as well. So the same literature also provides us with some insights on the role of the clergy and religious personnel. Again, these studies are informed by different contexts, but I'll draw some of the sort of insights that agree across contexts and cultures. Victimized women in religious communities do tend to share their ordeals with clergy, who oftentimes are sort of the first point of reference, because there is that confidentiality oftentimes. But when they do that, they might minimize the seriousness of their situation, whether because they feel guilty or ashamed, so they might not communicate the real nature of the problem they're facing. On the other hand, clergy responses may prove inappropriate, and they can actually contribute to put the victim in more safety risks, because they're not responding with the sensitivity and considering the safeguarding risks involved. And that's because the clergy may not understand the psychology of domestic violence, of the domestic violence victim or perpetrator, may have insufficient seminary training, and they don't know how to communicate, essentially how to adapt their theological training to the problem of domestic violence and how to counsel. Also, they might feel a responsibility. They might feel that it's their responsibility to preserve the marriage. So they might not, they might feel hesitant to actually give advice because they don't want to influence human decision making. On the other hand, it has been also demonstrated that faith leaders and clergy can be positively influential. I'm sorry, someone is knocking on my door. Can I stop for a minute? Apologies. This is the beauty of working from home. Thank you so much. So the other insight is that clergy, while they can have this sort of, they can unwittingly contribute to create new risks for the victims of domestic violence, they do try to support oftentimes, and they do try to act and help them oftentimes, at their own personal risk, but that can prove counterproductive as well. Another, there is also the agreement that, again, there is informed by the spiritual psychotherapy sector that actually theological support and pastoral mediation can help victims and perpetrators alike to try and deal with emotional and psychological states and disturbances that they might be experiencing if it's done properly and in an informed manner. So there's also some important studies quite emerging that show intersections with psychological and relational parameters. And this is really the relationship at the heart of my presentation today. As I said, some scholarship focuses on how church attendance or religious values that people embody in their personal relationships with people influence, again, their behavior and the intimate relationship in particular. I have included two here. There are multiple. It's an extensive field. The specific question of religious attendance and religiosity and the relationship to marital relationships. For example, one study in the US found that regular religious attendance is inversely associated with the perpetration of domestic violence. So it has a positive influence in deterring abusiveness. Among male members, this protective effect in the specific study was evident only among weekly attenders, whereas among women, the protective effect also surfaced among monthly attenders. So that means that men have to attend more frequently for that effect to come in. In another study, religious beliefs and practices among American Catholic and Orthodox Christian families showed that practices such as prayer and attending worship services were related to people trying to seek forgiveness and resolve conflict in order to build unified and harmonious or peaceful family relationships. And of course, there is the literature, as I mentioned, which to me is the most fascinating, and I'm trying to wrap my head around. I don't have expertise in attachment theory, but these studies are very interesting because they suggest that individual reliance on an appraisal of God as an attachment figure is not unrelated to attachment models that individuals develop with other humans in their life. So, the way people sort of relate to their parents, attachment theory suggests that this will influence how they relate to other to romantic partners in adult life. What these additional studies suggest is that actually those relationships we develop with parental figures or other attachment figures at the human level can actually also associate or relate to the attachment we have to God, whether we turn to God or not, our relationship to religious experience. Now, scholarly opinions have varied on whether the relationship is one of correspondence, what is called correspondence, which is really the thesis that attachment patterns with humans correspond to attachment patterns with individual experience with God. So if we are secure, we were raised to have secure internal working models with parents or caregivers in early life, then we will also have secure models, secure attachment models towards God and religious experience. This is what the thesis says. Another side speaks about compensation. So these are attachment patterns, the thesis that attachment patterns with humans and God do not correspond because really God functions as a substitute attachment figure. So the idea that if you have insecure internal working models because of early relationships to caregiver or parents, then you might turn to God exactly because of that insecurity to sort of substitute for that early sort of a lack of stability in that relationship. And there's multiple studies. This goes again in the past 2 decades. I've come across multiple studies. Andreas Bergergaard and his colleague found, for example, that individuals who have developed secure parental internal working models will tend to display more secure relationship to God. So this is the correspondence thesis. Hal and his colleagues, on the other hand, argued that correspondence, so they actually try to move away from this debate of correspondence versus compensation. And they actually said that, well, there is a corresponding relationship, but the correspondence of human attachment models to God as an attachment figure operates at implicit levels of spiritual experience. So it's about how we understand life, our attitude in life from a spiritual point of view, and not really at the explicit spiritual function. So in terms of religious practice, religious tradition, and the cognitive understanding of one's faith. And Pollard and colleagues later sort of looked at this literature again and found that attachment avoidance. So they found there is a combination of things that support both aspects of the compensation theory and the correspondence thesis. And they found essentially that attachment avoidance is most strongly linked to the lack of a secure positive relationship to God, but attachment avoidance can be less detrimental to marital functioning when the individuals use more positive religious coping strategies. So what this means, I know it's a very technical language, but essentially it means that individuals who are attachment avoidant, so they feel that they don't need someone else, and they seek that independence and autonomy, they will have they will lack the secure relationship with God as well. But if they do have a positive relationship to God, then that relationship can mediate their attachment and security in the relationship, in the intimate romantic relationship. So what does that really mean? It's just very interesting, significant connections that we can explore further. In addition to these studies, there have been specific studies that have looked at domestic violence, such as the one by Mauritian colleagues. And what this research has done, it has associated avoidant attachment mediated by some personality disorder with psychological and physical violence. So there is a relationship between being avoidantly insecure and having a personality disorder due to that insecurity, and using psychological or physical violence. And they have found also a direct relationship between being anxiously insecure and using psychological violence, okay? Now, if higher attachment insecurity may be related to psychological or physical violence, and again, based on study, they find a slightly different findings. But if attachment insecurity is related to psychological or domestic violence, and attachment models with humans relate also or are influenced or influence attachment models with God, then one's relationship with God could potentially mediate marital adjustments, and by inference, the likelihood of one resorting to violence, depending on whether the relationship is one of correspondence or compensation, or a mix of the two. So as I said, I'm not an expert. This is a question I'm putting out there. Given all these studies that we have, and if we try to bring everything together and connect everything together, then there might be room to explore further how religious conscience and religious and spirituality interface with attachment and security and domestic violence, and could actually become resourceful or impede marital adjustment. So being aware of these mechanisms could help us actually to understand how to support better religious victims and perpetrators. So now I'll move straight to the ethnographic study in Aksum. I know time is flying. And just to break a bit the monotony of the presentation, I put a photo of the village where I was stationed for 6 months in Aksum in northern Ethiopia. And my compound, a very modest compound. I lived with another female, a resident, and she braided hair, so all the females in the village would visit frequently, but of course my research included also males. And this is a home, what it looks from the inside. This is an interview conducted with a soldier, and obviously he has a weapon, very peaceful people, obviously, and as you see, very modest premises. So the research occurred 2016, 2017. And again, in order to address the shortfalls in the gender-based violence and public health literature on domestic violence that I mentioned early on, I tried to essentially use a gender-sensitive ethnographic approach and also embed that in a historiographical and theology-informed analysis. So really try a multidimensional study to honor, to do justice to the complexity of the situation. And I was based in Aksum, which is the historical center of indigenous Orthodox Christianity in the country. Now, in Ethiopia, the 3 last demographic and health surveys have shown a significant numbers of men and women across the country justifying wife hitting in certain situations that seem to be very gendered, such as when the woman neglects the children or argues with her husband and so forth. Although these have declined over time, so things have been improving. The majority of available studies from Ethiopia have assumed, again, on the basis of theory, of sociological theory, that etiologies that tend to consider culture or violence to be the outcome of an oppressive culture, or cultural pressures and material constraints faced by women, who are the predominant victims. However, the scholarship, although very insightful and inquit still, and there have been studies that actually have gone deeper than that, still the majority of the evidence that we have lacks doesn't demonstrate really the causal relationship between domestic violence and sociocultural norms, or what culture even means to people, and how then that informs their human behavior and psychology. So looking at that triptych behavior of belief system, normative practice, and human behavior. So that's 3 levels of analysis. Bringing those 3 together is a very big task, and we lack these studies. And unfortunately, a lot of literature misconstrues the local religious tradition, and it's quite atheological. It doesn't include exegesis, or it doesn't review the theology of the church. And of course, some of the literature, which again is mostly written in English, so this is the Anglophone literature. There might be studies that are in local languages and they are more locally grounded that I might have not seen, but I'm referring primarily to the Anglophone literature written by both Western and Ethiopian scholars. They also have neglected to consider the variegated gender relations across Ethiopia. So it's not a monolithically oppressive culture. It's not. It's a very diverse culture with it's a very diverse landscape with multiple cultures. More than 80 languages are spoken in Ethiopia, so that says a lot about the ethnic variability in the country. And the long history of Ethiopian women fighting wars and being in leadership positions, but also the improved status of women in recent years. So I just wanted to take a bit of a more nuanced approach and really try to look at that relationship ethnographically and based on human stories. This is from Aksum during Easter week, the Holy Week. People tend to camp outside of Mariam Tzion. This is the Church of St. Mary, where people, will spend the whole Holy Week praying outside and fasting. So the first thing before I delve into the relationship that really concerns us is to just give you an overview of the key conceptualizations of domestic violence that emerge, because again, it's hard for me to tell you what I found out unless I build gradually the story so you can have the overview. So most people spoke about conjugal conflict, arguments, or disagreement. So most interactional situational violence, what we would call, in the literature, because of men getting drunk, going out with other women, maybe refusing to provide as breadwinners, and this cannot escalate to physical violence. And women could, now, most of the violence was by both men and women was associated with male behavior, but some did speak about women being perhaps partially responsible for some conflict because of not having a non-confrontational attitude. So in this culture, as it will become evident in the specific context that I was in, the standard would be for a female to be timid, what is called timid, tahut in local language, and not confrontational. So being confrontational was, could actually trigger more argument on behalf of the husband, and this could turn bad for her. But also many people mention that out of practicality, because they know that if you argue back, then you get even more argument afterwards, and it can become risky for the female. A few women also spoke about some difficult women, which actually I had an encounter with one that was considered a difficult woman. They understood this as a woman who is controlling of her husband or disrespectful in some way. And then some spoke about women's abusiveness towards husbands because of changes in relationship norms, women becoming more assertive, and anything that people related to modernity, Zamenawinnet in the local language. Also, a lot of discussion revolved around gender asymmetries. There was an unfair division of labor between wives and husbands that everyone acknowledged, and also the persistence of early marriage for girls, although the law stipulates 18 years of age as marriage age. Abandonment of wives by husbands. This was an extensive phenomenon, and also the failure to provide for child support in the aftermath. And sexual coercion, interestingly, while it is reported in all of the studies available in Ethiopia currently, it wasn't talked about at all by my participants. So I had to find very creative ways to try and unpack this. And it turned out that, again, it's considered that it is a woman's responsibility to always respond to her husband's sexual needs at reasonable times. So that means acceptive when she's, after childbirth, or in her menses, fasting periods, and so on. And depending on the type of abuse, because there are multiple types, as you can see, people gave slightly different explanations, but overall, those included characterological defects. So the personality of the perpetrator was really the main problem and the fundamental justification. Relationship issues, so lack of love or communication, and also the persistence of what people called a past or old unegalitarian mentality persisting a bit among both men and women, some parts of the society. So overall, it was a very complex landscape, right? Like in any society, whether it's here in the UK or in Moldova, where I'm from, or in Ethiopia. There were a lot of arrangements, gender norms, and expectations, spousal expectations in the marriage, such as that the husband has to be the breadwinner, the female has to take care of the house, the female has to respond to the sexual needs of the husband, this expectation that the wife has to be timid and non-confrontational, and hence the tensions emerging with the change, of relationship norms and spousal expectations. At the same time, there were strong cultural standards. And as you see, I don't separate religious from cultural because it's very hard for anyone to know where these are influenced, what these, where these trace to really. But they were standards of morality and values in the local society that condemned violence and conflict and really spoke about peace. This is the main discourse of the clergy, peaceful relationships. Respect and righteousness, people spoke about human dignity, that everyone should respect human dignity. Neighborly interference to stop conflict if someone argued, so people would normally interfere. And also societal and church-related sanctions to shame perpetrators and to stop, abusive behavior. But at the same time, there was what I call an underlying tolerance, for lack of a better word, seen in the ineffectiveness of the local institutions to deal properly with cases of domestic violence, such as the police, the social court, even women's associations for other reasons. And also in women's endurance and secretiveness. Women just did not speak and did not communicate domestic violence. But they did communicate it to the clergy. So all the participants, I did a number of participatory workshops in two villages, 2 with women and 2 with men, and we had numerous discussions. And I asked them to rank the institutions that are most relevant to them when they face marital issues. Where do they resort to at first? In the first instance, and they all spoke about the clergy. Although again, the social court and the police are becoming more salient in people's minds, the clergy are still the main sort of the first point of reference, together with elders and family members. So look, the clergy tended to be the typical mediators in problems of conjugal conflict. And again, I should note that as the literature suggested, other studies have found, women wouldn't necessarily communicate to the priest the real nature of their problem, that the husband is maybe physically abusive. They will just minimize the situation, and they would say he's being difficult or something of the sort. And the laity do trust the clergy, although they know that the clergy as people have limitations in their own married lives. The clergy in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition must be married before they're ordained. So although many were not the best examples in their own married lives, people thought that the word they taught was the word of God. So they made the distinction between what they taught and how they behaved in their own life. They understood that one cannot just always embody the standard. And most rural priests that I spoke to and interviewed, and again through the narratives that people communicated to me about these mediations, evidence that they opposed pernicious cultural condom practices. They spoke against the gender-based violence division of labor, that man and wife should share the work and so forth. But at the same time, they seem to unwittingly perhaps enforce sociocultural gender norms by stressing Judaic or Old Testament elements of the religious tradition, neglecting New Testament theology, especially apostolic theology that speaks of equality, marriage, and mutuality. Because this was the Judaic and the Old Testament heritage of the church is highly valued in the culture by the people. So essentially, they felt the pressure to sort of abide by that Old Testament heritage to show that they remain Orthodox and they're not Protestantizing, because unfortunately to them, Protestantism, the expansion of Protestantism in the culture is seen as a risk. So they felt that they needed to sort of preserve the tradition and what people know as a tradition to prove that they're Orthodox. Now, in their mediation, many priests ask the women proactively when they went into a home if she was experiencing abuse, and they tried to understand, if they suspected something, they would take each spouse aside, talk to each other, and try to understand who is at fault, and then speak to the perpetrator, give them a few rules or rulings to follow, and then if they didn't reform, then they would advise the female to take action, or do what is necessary. They did not insist on reforming perpetrator behavior, however, because of the theology of the church, which is fundamentally based on free human will. So, they would say, if he doesn't listen to me, he can go. So they would just abandon them. They wouldn't be their spiritual children anymore. And again, while priests spoke about the one-to-one marriage, so the lifelong marriage, the one flesh and so forth, all the time, constantly, they did not oppose divorce when that was necessary. So normally, what would happen? They would mediate. If the couple wouldn't be responsive, if the perpetrator wouldn't reform, then they would send them to the elders to continue with the divorce processes. So there would be, the formal processes, dividing the assets and so forth. They wouldn't be involved in that. They wouldn't advise actively divorce, but they would not, interfere with that. They would just let them go and seek that option. I also looked at how faith influences people's marital relationships to the extent that I could. Marriage, and this was kind of naturally because people spoke about it, so I had to account for it. Most people thought that spouses, in marriages where spouses were both spiritual and were committed to religious commandments, the relationships were healthier and more successful and lasted longer. Female research participants affirmed that going to church, that when their husbands went to church, they became calmer and more considerate, again, reinforcing the studies that we saw early in the literature review. And the interesting thing, that women did use faith, or did see faith and God, the figure of God, as a coping mechanism, certainly not as a source of justifying intimate abuse, because the theology is very clearly condemning it and against it. However, in addition, it emerged that psychological reasons were very salient. So, because they loved the man, because they thought he would be reformed, but also because if they divorced, he could, they would be, exposed to poverty, since they are not breadwinners. The male is the breadwinner, so they wouldn't really have a sustenance way. But also, if they divorced, then they risked being gossiped as bad wives, which then puts them at risk of not being able to get married again because they have the stigma. And again, remarrying is important for them to have a ways of sustenance, a means of sustenance. And I'm talking here about the rural the rural populations, because in the cities, the dynamics is slightly different. Men were considered generally in the society less spiritual, and I think you see that in many societies that are religious, men are considered less spiritual. But actually, the narratives I heard from men and the stories they told me, and intimated some very interesting stories and narratives that I describe in my papers. It emerged that men who had a very strong faith-based conscience, they actually could sort of use faith, drew from faith and drew from religious values, whether it is righteousness or morality, to stop themselves from committing, sinful acts, what they would describe as sinful acts, whether it is adultery, so hurting the woman in that way, or abandoning the wives and the children, for example. So again, the discourse that the clergy used of morality and righteousness in the local community seemed to be very influential with the males in particular. This is another photo from a marriage I attended in the village. Again, as you see, many women sit sort of separately, but everyone dances together. It's a very lively atmosphere. And before I get into the psychological parameters to end this presentation, I just wanted to refer very quickly on the tendency among local people to rationalize abusiveness in reference to the individual personality, what they call bahri, of the perpetrator. So instead of blaming the sociocultural system, most people wouldn't think it's a societal issue. They would think it's a personality issue of the perpetrator. And this might actually explain why they thought that the solution shouldn't be society-wide, but it's actually about changing the individual. And of course, the individual, when one tried to understand how they conceptualize it, is informed. The concept of bahri is informed by the people's overall belief system. So the individual is biological, sociological, and spiritual simultaneously. And because they are always fighting a war against evil spirits and Satan, the arch enemy of Christ, people are always always risk fickleness, always risk being becoming succumbing to passions, and that could also translate in becoming abusive. So extreme acts of violence in the intimate relationships, such as a wife was killed by her husband accidentally in a conflict in the family a year before my research. People would describe these as senseless, usually accidental, and committed under the influence of satanic spiritual influence. So when there was no rational justification that people could think about, then they would just end up saying, Satan, no, it's God, Satan, you. Sorry, it's Satan. It's a satanic influence. Now, the human nature was considered, and the human personality was genderless in the sense that everyone had the same bahri, everyone had a human personality, everyone had, the human nature is common in everyone, if that makes sense. So it wasn't, gender specific, but at the same time, the gender norms of the broader society that expected the woman to be timid and shy and non-confrontational, and also believed that men were less spiritual and thus had less protection from their faith against spiritual influences, meant that people expected men to be more susceptible to these spiritual influences and passions. And so maybe I'm making a sort of a suggestion here that because of this belief, people were more willing to tolerate, or to justify, not to tolerate, but to justify misbehavior on the part of men. So what is the relevance to psychological parameters? Now, I have presented sort of the ethnographic insights, right? What I would present as an anthropologist, the relationship between gender norms, sociocultural norms, religious tradition. But my aim was to try and integrate into this relationship the psychological parameter to the best of my ability. And I've noticed some patterns in the local society that kind of link back to the studies I described earlier, and I think are really important for us to consider in the process of integrating the different dimensions in the analysis of domestic violence. So the proximity of the partners, for example, right, the conjugal conflict that was discussed, it could be in part because of the influence of gender norms and all these material and sociocultural pressures. But at the same time, it's important to remember the psychological factor, right? As researchers of intimate romantic relationships suggest, when an imbalance emerges because one party doesn't deliver, the other party gets frustrated, and then that feeds more frustration and more argument on the other partner, and then there is that alienation that happens gradually. So there's this negative reciprocity. So it's really important to understand how these psychological mechanisms play into conjugal conflict in the society. And of course, this could be even worse, this negative reciprocity, if we consider that some relationships lacked intimate communication or understanding, because these could have been arranged marriages or early marriages with a large age gap between between wife and husband. Now, the other important insight that emerges is that a lot of women felt that their boyfriends or husbands did not understand their feelings of love, that they could not communicate emotionally they cannot connect emotionally with their spouses or boyfriends. And this could be capturing, some attachment issues that are not being explored currently, are not being accounted at all, and also issues of empathy. So the narratives of wife abandonment are especially interesting because all the narratives I heard, and this was recurrent in most people in the societies I spoke to, had at least one divorce. Some people had 3 divorces, and most people had a story to tell. And their story was that, the female version, that at some point the husband suddenly changed his heart, left, and he had never connected intimately with the wife. Now, of course, changes in romantic relationships happen. People become alienated, over time. But usually, one understands and sees that coming. There is a gradual alienation process, I guess. My interlocutors interestingly affirmed that the husband or the boyfriend just suddenly really changed, became sort of a different person, and left, despite the relationship being good, having no real reason or argument happening before that. So, this abandonment of wives that was an extensive phenomenon could be potentially underpinned by some attachment issues in that specific group of men. So I'm not generalizing for all the men, the specific group of men. And some attachment insecurity, insecurely attached people of an avoidant type tend to keep an emotional distance from the intimate partners and consider that they can be self-sufficient without them. On the other hand, men's subsequent failure to provide for child maintenance may reflect economic scarcity and relationship dynamics, but it could also suggest a lower level of empathy, right? So it has to do with the upbringing of the specific individual. A recurrent parenting style that I also observed and we may consider was that in female-led households, because the husband was diseased or had left or temporarily moved to work in another place, the parenting style was a bit detached and sometimes abusive. Girls were usually slapped if they misbehaved, but boys were beaten harshly. The practice of corporal punishment was affirmed to be against the faith, but people also reported to have amplified in recent years. And again, it's important to remember here the psychological literature on this. Mothers' detached, judgmental, and unstable parenting style can influence the internal working models for the boys, and then inform how the adult men relate to romantic partners in the future. And this could be compounded by father's departure or a stepfather's abusive behavior with a child. And this actually was reported to be a frequent phenomenon because a lot of women remarried. So there is a generational aspect to violence, not just because children see abuse or experience it, but also because the mother is emotionally or physically abused by the husband, and then she transfers that into the child through the parenting model, the parenting style. So what does the study tell us, finally? Essentially, it tells us that any strategies to address domestic violence in this particular community would need to consider how people think about domestic violence at a more fundamental level, how they think about human nature and the possibility to reverse human abusiveness, societal pressures, material concerns, and the psychological reasons that could be underpinning some perpetrator behavior. And I think this really speaks to the need for integrated approaches, not just strengthening local state-led institutions to address better domestic violence, but also it's important to develop counter discourses to that the human nature or the human personality can be improved, that it's not just predetermined or determined by the spiritual war, drawing ideally from Orthodox theology, which is resourceful in this case, employing psychosocial tools to help perpetrators address psychological factors of abusiveness, and also supporting couples in conflict resolution skills and communication. On the other hand, priests will need to be equipped theologically to be able to know how to not enforce folklore practices framed in religious idiom. They need to be a bit more aware of their language. They also need to be trained in the psychology of domestic violence and safeguarding to be able to to support victims and perpetrators with sensitivity and without increasing the risks for the victim. And just I wanted to end with a note that we have received some funding to continue this research. The first one is looking at this relationship from a sort of an academic scholarly perspective in combination with research with men in Aksum. So we continue in the same field site. And the one that was just received successfully, which Parveen will join me in, is a new grant funded by UKRI. And here we will, this is a research and innovation project that will aim to develop religio-culturally sensitive systems, working in Ethiopia and then moving to Eritrea and returning to the UK. So I'll stop here with the references. You're welcome to revisit them. And thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over time.
Thank you, Romina. Wow, that was really useful. Thank you so much. I'm just conscious of time, so I will straight go into the questions and see what sort of things people have been asking for. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to start off from. So one of the questions which Shalwa has asked: when domestic violence increases, do possession cult thrives?
Possession cult, so as in being possessed by evil spirits?
I am not sure. Shalwa, are you around? Will you be
able to
speak and ask your question? I am You can unmute yourself.
I've worked a lot in Ethiopia. I loved your talk. It was so interesting and rang so true. I was wondering about, you talked very much about mainstream religion, but what happens often is that when domestic violence increases, women resort to possession cults. They go to what's called a tankwai, who's a healer, and then they go into all these kind of ecstatic states. And I wondered whether you've, I'm an anthropologist, whether you studied that, and it's directly relevant to your lecture. And I also have a second question later, which I didn't write down on the chat, if you would be generous enough to answer it. So we'll try that one first.
Okay, thank you, Shalva. No, this is great. Good to meet another fellow anthropologist. Great. So you're right. Most of the studies that around spirit beliefs that I looked at, because I did an integrate that I mentioned, was from Amhara region, not Tigray region.
Right.
And in Amhara region, there's a lot on Tenkwai, on Buddha, on Zar, and so forth, different states, and the bad eye, and so forth. And I did include that. Essentially, what I was trying to do in this research is not force the language on the people, but let them invoke things that are relevant to them. So I didn't want to introduce the term if it weren't relevant. So they didn't bring up the Zar at all, but they did bring up the Buddha, some random, some sudden deaths that had happened might be associated with the Buddha and the evil eye, and the few references that were made, I can't generalize on the basis of those, but they were gendered in the sense that they tended to speak about the implications of these forces in gender terms. So, a woman being possessed and then not being a good wife, for example, right? So they had these gendered implications, but I didn't find a relationship that would suggest that women would resort to these sort of para-Christian belief systems in order to find some sort of coping mechanism or understanding of what seemed sometimes to be unreasonable experiences of violence or abandonment. Most people, again, would think of Satan, and even when they thought about Buddha, they would still trace the Buddha to Satan because it's the arch enemy of Christ. And I do suspect that it has to do with the fact that this is the center of Orthodox Christianity, so these beliefs would be perhaps slightly weaker, at least in public discourse, as opposed to maybe other parts of Ethiopia. But it was an interesting question. I don't have a conclusive statement on this.
Thank you, Romina. And that's really interesting that, while we are talking about, a lot of examples that you use is from Christianity and how people have done. But I could see a lot of similarities in terms of, coming from the Muslim background. That how people and I think a lot of this perhaps does not necessarily have to do with the religion, because religion, as in Islam or Christianity, does not really support superstitiousness and that sort of thing. But people have found their own explanations and do tend to attracted towards it, be it for the solutions of the problems, or it is the explanations of what's happening in their life. As to, if the husband is possessed by these things or evil eye, or someone have casted an evil eye or things like that, which is really very interesting. It tells you something about human nature, mind, as opposed to actually, and the rationalization that we use in the form of religions, or other aspects just to justify it. Basically.
Yes. And just to add, I think you're absolutely right. And again, the literature is unfortunately dominated by Western Christian traditions. Even Eastern Christianity is not addressed. I find it unfortunate that there's not more on Islamic traditions in this specific fields I've dealt with, but they might exist and I haven't accessed them. And there are similarities. These kind of trends and patterns, especially this discourse of what is culture, what is religion, is a recurrent theme. My previous research was in Senegal with the Sufi Muslim community. It was slightly different because it was informed by the specific sort of tradition in the brotherhood, right, and what was considered authoritative teaching within that brotherhood. But there was also this conversation constantly about what is right interpretation, what is culture, what is religion, what is authoritative teaching, and when there isn't a common agreement, necessarily common discourse, as you say, that creates possibilities for resorting to other explanations and other belief systems.
And I think And I think it also goes back to how women are seen and how religion is being used to justify the status of women, or to force women to be seen like, what you should be, what is an obedient good wife, and what is an obedient good woman, and how should you be as a good woman, or as a good daughter, as a good, the things which are imposed on them as a gender role, and gender role expectations that we have from them. And that doesn't seem to, in my understanding, that doesn't seem to change in any religion.
It's human. I think you're right, Praveen. It's human nature. We again, and that's why I think this again speaks back to the necessity of being locally grounded in understanding these discourses. How is a religious authority invoked in order to justify something, or to not justify it, right? To deter it. So if we understand those mechanisms, then actually we can use the same discourse resourcefully to reverse pernicious patterns. And this is really what I'm advocating for, and I think is necessary.
Completely believe that. Okay, so I'll just take, so another question is, Armina is asking, domestic violence is one of the strongest predictors of suicidal behavior, both in perpetrator and the victim. Have you found anything about this in your studies, and how would you address the link in your future research?
Yeah, this is again another link. Unfortunately, not much immersed in my research. People did not speak about suicide, and I suspect that again is one of those taboo topics that people would keep to themselves. And also, even if it's suicide, it doesn't really get recorded as such. I mean, the person who committed the suicide might be the only one who knows the real motivations, and I don't think it's being communicated or recorded properly. So people did not speak about suicide, but they did speak about not in the villages, in the cities and in the diaspora. I should have added that I did some research with the Ethiopian and Eritrean communities here in London before going to Ethiopia. The people here in the diaspora, women affected by domestic violence or who have friends affected by domestic violence, did bring up the issue of suicide because these women felt helpless, especially in the diaspora context, being away from home. It added additional pressures and material constraints, and suicide was considered, a really urgent matter in the diaspora, but it's not something unfortunately discussed in the village communities.
And quite a lot of stuff around not only suicide, but forced suicide, homicide, and femicide, where some of these things have been used. Like, for example, femicide, where the perpetrator commits suicide and kills the children to make the woman believe that she's the one who is responsible for it, or killing of the children. So there are quite a lot of practices which happens, and again, I'm not sure I don't think there's any religious explanations to it, but people do use religion and culture and their own motives to justify their behavior as they move on.
Yeah, I have something to add to that. I mean, as you said, it's not I mean, in this case, they couldn't possibly use orthodoxy to explain it, but they will use what orthodoxy gives them to explain it. So the war by Satan against humanity, right?
Yeah.
Where Satan uses the human passions. And sometimes when bad things happen, as I said, that murder, and also a wife who then remarried another husband, went back with the new partner and killed her husband, the former husband. Those were described as accidental, senseless acts. And when I ask people, why do you think they're senseless? And they say, well, there isn't any other explanation. They had a good family. They had, they were economically well. All the children were doing well. I can't think of a reason. So it must have been senseless. It must have been a minute of insanity, that someone did something so terrible. So yes, I think your belief system gives you the explanatory categories in which you frame then your thinking, right? I think it applies to all of us, regardless of whether we are in a religious or secular belief system.
Okay, I'll just take next question very quickly. And if we could try and be a little bit brief, so I'm conscious that people have to move and started leaving the group. So let's conclude this. So Yuxi is asking if this study can speak for all religious-based areas or just in the specific place that you targeted.
Yeah, I think we kind of mentioned this, already addressed this. There are some patterns that are, I think, cross-cultural, across contexts. I think the key message is that you need to take a theology-specific approach, applies to any context. I believe you really need to understand the tradition you're dealing with and how that tradition has been communicated and embodied by the people, and how people sort of use that in their daily life. to make decisions and to understand themselves and others. This relationship between culture and religion, and how people sometimes use religious discourse to justify cultural practice and then not feel bad about it. I think that again applies across cultures in the context, and also the methodological approach, and then the broader idea of integrating the different dimensions. I think again it's something that we can take away for any context and try to integrate those psychological parameters in the analysis.
And I think it is more so about culture, because if I look at the example of Pakistan, South Asian countries, Pakistan, India, and all these places, so regardless of if you are Christian or Muslim or Hindu, you tend to have similar sort of practices, and every one of them would find religious explanations from their own religion to justify the same practice in the same way. But actually, it's quite a lot of that is cultural, not necessarily religious. But it's just so difficult to disentangle culture and religion with each other, and distinguish with what is culture and what is religion, that it becomes, to a certain extent, it just becomes meaningless. But I think where religion is a very powerful source which you could use very powerfully to prevent abuse, especially in communities who claim to be practicing and who think that the religion is an important part of their life. And I don't think we have tapped into that sort of resource.
Yes, yeah. This is where I'm trying to bridge religious scholarship with gender and development and public health, because I think you really need this religious scholarly perspective. How can we use the authoritative discourse resourcefully, and how can we be aware of its limitations in that effort? So absolutely. And I'm conscious that Shalva wanted to ask another question.
Yes, that's the last question, and we will hopefully, I don't see any other questions into the chat box, so I think probably there are not any more. Thank you for sharing resources, Mendy and other people. So Shalva, if you ask your question, then we'll conclude the session.
Thank you. I just wanted to add another layer to this, that I actually study femicide amongst Ethiopian Jews. But everything you've described, so that we've talked about Muslims, Christians, but it really doesn't have any, as you both pointed out, it doesn't make any difference. The cultural patterns are exactly the same. And the perpetrator of a victim in Israel of an Ethiopian Jewess always says what you said. It's the Devilos, or the Satan, that did it. However, I wanted to ask you about something that came up in my research. There's a very interesting balance between people getting divorced amongst Ethiopians. It's Ethiopian Jews, but I know it's the same everywhere, and I've been a lot to Ethiopia. So they get divorced quite frequently, more than people that Western people, and yet there are these balances and checks. So there's the fear that a woman will become what's called a galamota. She'll become alone, and then she'll be susceptible to domestic violence in a big way. And according to my informants, a galamota cannot refuse a man to have sexual intercourse, etc. And so she's very open to being violated. And most of the cases of femicide actually happen with this galamota case. I don't know whether you have galamota in Tigrinya, but it's in Amharic anyway.
Yes, I mean, I did not come across this term. And again, most people in the village spoke Tigrinya, the women.
Right, but most of my informants, although I have Tigranian informants, most of them were Amharic, but they talk about galamota.
But I think there is maybe there is a parallel though that I designed that might be interesting to your study, that women again were sort of thinking that getting into a new marriage was almost like a protective factor, if that
right, because he would defend her.
Yes, because
from other men.
Material concerns, many other psychological
and material concerns,
issues, but as you say, many other risks that maybe didn't really emerge in my research. So yes, essentially what I'm trying to draw attention to is that getting into new marriages is not just an emotional decision. You just love someone, but it has many other motivations that we need to unpack. Yeah, absolutely. Very well, Shalva. Thank you so much. I'd love to read more.
To keep up in contact. If I don't know how to get your emails, but
we'll post that into the chat, Shalva, and you could also email us. You've got my email, and I think you've. Ravina, do you want to put your email into the chat box?
Yes, I'm going to stop sharing.
That you're talking about, both of this is again goes back to gender, isn't it? It's about this thing that the women cannot live on their own, and they're not protected on their own. They need protection of a man, and therefore or honor of a man, and therefore they need to have marriage, or they need to have a man named and something like that, which again seems to be a very cross-cultural sort of thing, which is applied in across any culture everywhere. And usually the religious connotations have been given, and you will also see that many men, they justify marrying divorced women or separated women as a good deed, as if they're the one who are helping them to live their life. So it's, those discourses are quite interesting in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right, and I think I think the challenge here is to not, as you say, not to collapse everything in one, and just at the level of discourse, and understand that there are material and psychological motivations behind many of these, right? And it's really complex. It's not like you change the discourse, you change the norms, and suddenly the problem is not there anymore. That's why I'm saying it's an integrated approach that is needed to address all these parameters simultaneously.
Thank you so much, everybody. And it would be great if you were able to put your cameras on so we could take a photograph, if you don't mind.
Oh. And
I hope you like the session. I did posted a link earlier on. So if anyone of you would like to have the certificate, there are some people who've been asking. Just I've given you a form and link. So if you could just fill that form, and I will, I'm not promising when, but I'll try to be quick and send it to you. If that's okay. And do give us any, and if any one of you are working in this area and are interested in speaking, do contact me, and we will hopefully be able to organize something else. So I'm just going to take a picture, if that's okay. I'm just trying to see, there are still quite a lot of cameras which are not on.
I see some people I know. Mandy. I believe everyone is so tired of virtual events. I apologize to be creating another occasion.
Okay, so I'm just going to take a photo, if that's okay with everyone. And I always forget how to take that one, which finger, so I'm just going to use various different commands. Oh God. Yes, I think I've managed. Thank you ever so much, everybody. And if you have got any feedback or any comments or anything, do get back to us.
Thank you so much. Stay in touch, please. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Hi, Dita.